Jesus. What comes to your mind when you hear that name? Maybe you think of the divine miracle worker, how Jesus healed the sick and turned water into wine, walked on the waves and woke up in a windstorm to calm the weather and his disciples' worries. How he fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and a few fish. How he raised a young girl from the dead. How he conquered the grave himself and rose again. It's easy and comfortable for us to picture Jesus in this extraordinary fashion. And certainly it's important for us to see him this way. Jesus himself said, "I and the Father are one." John said of him, "He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made." Peter called him Son of the living God. And Thomas once declared he was my Lord and my God. Jesus didn't correct either disciple. Jesus was fully divine, all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful. And yet the Bible makes it clear he was also all-human. He was born as a man and became like a servant. He got colds. He grew weary on long walks, suffered from headaches and backaches and every other kind of ache. He likely had calluses on his hands and bunions on his toes. He snored and sneezed and hit his thumb with a hammer. He had to wipe the sweat from his eyes and the manure off his feet when he stepped in the wrong place on the road. For many of us, to think of Jesus in such a light seems almost irreverent. We would rather keep the humanity out of the incarnation, to picture him as a mighty miracle worker rather than one who has been tempted in every way just as we are. There's something about keeping Jesus divine that keeps him distant, packaged, predictable. But let's remember that the people who saw him first saw him as a person. Jesus appealed to them because he was one of them, a member of their community, of their neighborhood. Often when we read the Bible, it's hard for us to picture him this way. The location is foreign to us. The customs are odd. The politics are just confusing. It's hard for us to relate. But what would it look like if Jesus were to come to our neighborhood today? Who are the people on the block he would meet? How would he respond to them? What would they think of him? This is what we will look at in this study. How the people of the day saw Jesus as a real person. How Jesus broke through all kinds of social barriers to reach them. And we will start with this fella, the one up in the tree. Joseph was a respected man back in his hometown. He was well established and happy there, and recently he had become engaged to a lovely young lady. He liked having his feet squarely on the ground. It was stable, reliable, predictable. He had roots there. The problem was that God had asked him to go out on a limb. And this limb was not near the ground. No, it was quite a bit higher up the tree. Joseph, no doubt, had gasped the first time he spied it. He had never seen one so thin. There was no place to sit and get comfortable, no protection from the weather. Surely God wasn't really asking him to go up there. Common sense told him not to go out on the limb, conceived by the Holy Spirit. Come on. Self-defense told him not to do it. Who will believe me? And what will our families think? Convenience told him not to do it, just when I was hoping to settle down and raise a family. And pride told him not to do it. If she expects me to buy a tale like that. Besides, Joseph was well aware of the kind of fella who went out on a limb. Radical, extremist, always stirring the leaves, guys with their heads full of strange ideas in search of foreign fruit. The stable ones, Joseph reasoned, were those who knew how to stay close to the trunk and leave well enough alone. But still, the problem persisted. For still, God persisted, and so Joseph was left with a hard choice: follow his will or the Lord's. In the end, he knew there was only one option. For the only thing worse to Joseph than a venture into the unknown was the thought of denying his master. So, resolute, he had reached up and started to climb. With tight lips and a determined glint in his eye, he had placed one hand in front of the other until now he was fully out on the limb with only his faith in God as a safety net. Joseph had to adjust his expectations in order to see Jesus. So did Gabriel. He must have scratched his head at this assignment. He wasn't one to question his missions. Sending fire and dividing seas were all in an eternity's work for this angel. When God sent him out, Gabriel went. And when word got out that God was to become man, well, Gabriel was enthused. He could envision the moment, the Messiah in a blazing chariot, the King descending on a fiery cloud, an explosion of light from which the Messiah would emerge. What he didn't expect was to get a slip of paper with a Nazarene address. God will become a baby, it read. Tell the mother to name the child Jesus and tell her not to be afraid. Gabriel was never one to question, but this time he had to wonder. God will become a baby? Gabriel had seen babies before. He had been platoon leader on the bulrush operation. He remembered what little Moses looked like. It was okay for humans to be babies, but God? After all, the heavens themselves could not contain him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together, his scriptures would declare. Were he to step back, the creation would collapse. His resignation would spell humanity's evaporation. Besides, babies. Babies had to be carried and fed, bounced and bathed. To imagine some mother burping God on her shoulder, well, that was beyond what even an angel could imagine. And what of this name? Jesus? It was so common. Even Gabriel had more punch to it. Called the baby eminence or majesty or heaven sent. Anything but Jesus. But Gabriel had his orders. Take the message to Mary in a place called Nazareth. Never heard of it. But he assumed as he traveled it must be a special place, an upscale town with Roman palaces and Greek villas, a place fitting for God to live. Wrong. The hometown of God would be a single camel map dot on the edge of boredom. A sleepy village with more peasantry than pizzazz, a place of which people could only say, does anything good come out of there? And what about this Mary? Certainly, she at least must be a special girl, a diamond in the rough. But one peek told Gabriel she was no queen. She was a Jewish peasant who had barely outgrown her acne and had a crush on a guy named Joseph. Speaking of him, what did he know? Sure, he was a student of the Bible. He knew God's law and recited the Shema each day. He had a standing in his community, but at the end of the day, he was just a carpenter. Gabriel shook his head. The God of the universe was going to have dinner every night with him. The source of all wisdom was going to call this guy Dad. What if he got laid off? What if he got cranky? What if he wasn't willing to go out on a limb and keep Mary as his wife? Still, a mission was a mission. So Gabriel delivered the message. Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. The power of the Most High will overshadow you, so the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God. Thus, the announcement of the birth of God into the world was made. Fast forward 9 months. A very pregnant Mary and Joseph, now fully out on the limb, have made their way to the village of Bethlehem. The Roman Emperor Augustus has decreed a census must be taken, and everyone must go to their own town to register. It's a boon for the local economy, for many families in Israel, Joseph included, hail from the little town. And the streets are packed, as are the inns, and all the beds are taken, and every available mat and blanket has been put to use. It's doubtful anyone in town remembers the couple's arrival. After all, there's nothing novel about them. They were possibly just one of several families turned away that night, turned away to a stable on the outskirts of town. It stinks like all stables do. The stench of urine, dung, and sheep hangs in the air. Cobwebs cling to the ceiling, and a mouse scurries across the floor. Off to the side sits a group of shepherds, smelling like sheep and looking just as woolly. They sit silently, looking perplexed. Their night watch had been interrupted by an explosion of light from heaven and a symphony of angels. The black sky had exploded with brightness, and trees that were shadows jumped into clarity. Sheep that were silent became a chorus of curiosity. One minute the shepherds were dead asleep, and next they were rubbing their eyes and staring into the face of a heavenly choir. God goes to those who have time to hear him, and on this night he went to simple shepherds. Majesty in the midst of mundane, holiness in the filth of sheep manure and sweat, God came near. Were it not for those shepherds, there would have been no reception, and were it not for a group of stargazers, there would have been no gifts. As Matthew tells us, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews?" These wise men, or magi, are travelers in need of direction, and God has given it. He has led them to Jerusalem with a star, but he leads them to Jesus with Scripture. And when the magi make their inquiry in Herod's court, they learn a prophecy that tells them where to find Christ. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. It's interesting that the star reappears after they learn about the prophecy. It's as if the sign and the word work together to bring the wise men to Jesus. And so the seekers find the baby in an humble home and kneel down in his presence. They are the first Christian worshipers. They give him gifts: gold for a king, frankincense for a priest, myrrh for his burial. As for Herod, well, while he and the Magi share the same chapter, they don't share the same heart. The wise men travel a great distance to see Jesus, but Herod refuses to leave his own city. The wise men present treasures to honor the child. Herod issues an edict to kill him. Just as the same shaft of sunlight in a barn can cause birds to sing and rats to scurry, the same message stirs the worship of the wise men and activates the ire of the king. As a result, his obituary forever contains the sad designation of being the first person to reject Jesus Christ. Which brings us back to the limb-sitting Joseph. Matthew tells us, when the Magi had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt and stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." As it turns out, Joseph's fears had been justified. Life wasn't as comfortable as it had been. The limb he had grasped was indeed a slender one. He had become a fugitive of the law. He would spend the next 2 years trying to understand Egyptian before he could return. At times, that limb on which Joseph sat bounced furiously in the wind, but Joseph just shut his eyes and held on. And you can be sure of one thing, he never regretted it. Sweet was the reward for his courage. One look in the face of that heavenly toddler, and he knew he would do it again in a heartbeat. Limb climbing has never been easy, but Joseph knew it was worth it. When you look at the story of Jesus' birth, the question that comes to mind is why? Why did God decide to be born in such a humble setting? Why did the King of Kings choose to grow up in such an ordinary place and be such an ordinary person? According to the historian Origen, his body was small and ill-shapen and ignoble. If he had the appearance of people typical of his day, he likely had olive skin, a broad peasant's face, short curly hair, a prominent nose, and stood around 5 feet tall, hardly worthy of a GQ cover. Why did God do it? I think a chief reason is because he wants us to know he gets us. We don't have a high priest who is out of touch with our reality. He's been through weakness and testing, experienced it all but the sin. We have a high priest who is able to understand. And since he understands, we find mercy and grace when we need it. When we fall, we are not forgotten. When we stumble, we are not abandoned. Our God gets us. Are your looks run-of-the-mill and your ways simple? So were Jesus's. Do you struggle financially? Jesus knows how you feel. Are you on the lower rings of the social ladder? So was he. Ever feel betrayed? Christ can certainly relate. He was troubled in spirit. He felt overwhelmed with anxieties and grief. He prayed with loud cries and tears. He was so human he could touch his people, so mighty he could heal them. So human he spoke with an accent, so heavenly he spoke with authority. So human he could blend in unnoticed for 30 years, so mighty he could change history. All man, all God. And if you ever wonder if the uncreated Creator can comprehend the challenges you face, then ponder long and hard the promise of the Incarnation. The one who hears your prayers understands your pain. And when you turn to him for help, he runs to you to help. The writer of Hebrews states, Jesus who makes people holy, and those who are made holy are from the same family. So he is not ashamed to call them his brothers and sisters. He is not ashamed of you or confused by you. Your actions don't bewilder him. Your ways and tilted halo don't trouble him. So go to him. After all, you're a part of his family.